I don't know, my laptop?
Well, in fact, original computers referred to a computator, a person who does computations, a computer. So today we're going to be talking about female human computers. That sounds really weird now that I say it out loud. But they were they were computators, but they were women, and they programmed the world's first digital computer. Yippee. So today, instead of one woman, we're actually talking about six. Um, that's a lot, and I'm not gonna be able to go, or we're not gonna be able to go as in depth as we typically do. But these six women created something cool. They created something called the ENIAC. I'm calling it the ENIAC. But we have Kathleen McNulty, Mauchly Antonelli. Also, a lot of these are both their maiden and their like wed name, so that's why they have like multiple last names. Jean Jennings Bartik, Frances Elizabeth Holberton, Marilyn Westcoff Meltzer, Frances Bilius Spence, and Ruth Licherman Teitelbaum, maybe. But they were the programmers of the ENIAC, aka the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, which was the which was our like first like programmable electronic general purpose digital computer. Now, obviously, this looks like it looked nothing like a modern day computer. It weighed 30 tons, was 10 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and 100 feet long. So in total, it took up 300 square feet. For context, our dorms in Lever were 180 square feet. Yeah, so this was a huge project, but how on earth did women get this sort of opportunity in the 1940s? Because obviously, historically, women were not given these type of chances. World War II. So pretty much the only thing that war is good for is progress, and even then, at what cost? But the women behind the ENIAC were able to program for this project because most of the men who typically would have done the job were away at war. So, we're going to talk about each of the women individually before we get into kind of like a brief overview of the ENIAC project, but it's more or less to just like put their names out there because they were forgotten.
Okay. Kathleen McNulty Mauchly Antonelli was born in Donegal, Ireland on February 12, 1921, and immigrated to the US in October of 1924. She spoke only Gaelic at the time, which is the native Irish language. She grew up in Chestnut Hill in northwestern Pennsylvania, where she attended college at Chestnut Hill College for Women, very creatively named. Her main courses included college algebra, math, history, integral calculus, spherical trigonometry, differential calculus, and partial differential equations, aka DiffyQ. Yeah, that sounds disgusting, but more power to her. She graduated in 1942, one of only 3 math majors in a class of 92 girls. As most university students do, she started to look for jobs her junior year, and Kay decided that she was absolutely not going to do teaching. As we have mentioned, and I don't even know how many previous episodes, teaching was one of the few respectable professions for women. But it was wartime. Things were changing. The world didn't have an option to be bigoted because during war, countries could not physically continue to run without women. They just needed people to do their jobs, even if the women were taking the men's jobs. Otherwise, everything would collapse. Kay just happened to see a little ad in the paper in the 1940s version of like LinkedIn and Indeed, aka again the paper. The army was searching for women with math degrees in Pennsylvania. So she and her friend Frances, who we will talk about later, went to an interview and were accepted a week later as subprofessional computers.
Now, this really bothers me because a lot of our sources stated that men with the exact same education, exact same training, they were hired as professionals, but the women were hired as sub-professionals. Like, why? What do you mean? What do you mean that like they have the same degree, the only difference was their sex, and so one's professional and one's sub-professional? Which is not just like in naming, it's also like how they were paid. Anyways, on to the next. So we have Betty Jean Jennings Bartik, who was the youngest of the six and was born on December 27th, 1924, in Missouri. When the ENIAC project was announced, her local newspaper actually interviewed her high school principal, and he claimed that Jean was the brightest mathematics student out of anyone who had ever attended the school. When she graduated from what is now Northwest Missouri State University in 1944 with a degree in mathematics, she actually had originally started out as a journalism student, but apparently back then you have to like go to like regular college and then like journalism school afterwards, and like that was just super
Mm-hmm.
expensive. She wasn't from like a well-to-do family, and so she was like, yeah, math, that's cool. And she was like, math is just games and it's puzzles and like it's not really like a quote unquote so she said it's not a subject of serious study. And she was like, teehee, just math, just casually going to be solving differential equations. What do you mean? What do you mean? I struggle to pass calculus too. um but yeah, once again, Jean and Kay were like only once sorry, Jean, like Kay, so Kay, there was only one of three math majors. Jean was also one of three math majors in her entire school.
So, Jean didn't come from a privileged background and really struggled to pay for her education. Back then, it seems that tuition was based on semesters rather than courses. So, she was trying to finish 22 credits in one semester as opposed to the normal 16. Yeah, I've been there, done that. That is terrible.
Yeah.
The dean told her that that was impossible because half of the courses she needed to graduate weren't even offered in that semester. She went to the head of the math department, and he declared that since the college offered math as a major, it must offer the courses to allow her to graduate. So, Dr. J.W. Hake?
Hake.
Interesting. I've never heard that name before. But he found teachers to teach only her and scheduled it around her other classes in order for her to graduate. He was an ally.
So like basically it was like they were like private lessons. Like
Yeah.
it was like a whole classroom. It was just her and the
That
professor.
stuff would never fly nowadays.
No, definitely not.
No, but once again, Jean was encouraged to be a teacher. But she also had no interest in that and wanted to be an analyst at UPenn. She actually got the job and moved to Pennsylvania, where she worked for a little bit before hearing about some underground project, which would later become ENIAC. At the time, she knew next to nothing about the project because it was still classified, but she applied anyway. She ended up being selected as a second alternate, but due to extenuating circumstances, she ended up joining the official ENIAC team. She was just 20 years old when she began working on the project. Jean detailed how the women lived, worked, and bonded together, how they were so different and came from all walks of life, but were joined by a common purpose. Joined by a common purpose.
So next we have Frances Elizabeth Snyder Holberton, who preferred just Betty. She was born on March 7th, 1917, making her the oldest of the six. She actually graduated straight from UPenn in 1939 with a degree in journalism, but then ended up joining the computing unit at the Moore School. I don't know how she jumped from like computing or jumped from journalism to computing, but somehow. But the Moore School was the engineering school, and I think it still exists today. It's like the Moore School of Electrical Engineering. And the code name for the project at the time was Project PX, basically ENIAC. And it was happening in the basement of the Moore School. We don't have a ton of information, like during or before ENIAC for Betty. Actually, we have like no information on her, but she ended up working in computer science for the rest of her life. She won a bunch of accolades and was considered like one of the best computer scientists like afterwards. Like she didn't there's not as much information for her before, but she does a lot of cool stuff afterwards. But it's cool that she like didn't major in math, like not at all, and then just made a whole career out of like math and computing. Even though she originally majored in journalism.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Yeah, so then after that, we've got Marilyn Westcott Meltzer, who graduated from Temple University in 1942 with a degree in secondary education. Again, a teacher. But her focus was on social studies and English. And yeah, she actually struggled to find a job. Like everyone wanted women to be teachers, but then they were like, sorry, too many teachers, but still go be a teacher. And then one of her friends mentioned that the Moore School was hiring women who could use a calculator. Like basically that was the only qualification. Like they just needed a lot of computers, like human computers. They needed a lot of people just who could use calculators. And she also was able to use, I think, an addition table or a multiplication table, something. It was like some sort of like little machine that she could do like advanced calculations. And they were like, amazing, you're hired. And a lot of times she would do calculations and have no idea what she was calculating. Like they would just give her numbers and they'd be like, solve this. And she was like, what am I solving? But she would do it anyways because it's like it's wartime and everyone had to do their part. She worked day and night completely tirelessly. She didn't even remember how she got involved in ENIAC, but she remembers that she ended up taking advanced math classes that were offered to women. Like they were just like, hey guys, you got to take this class. They were like, why? And they were like, you just got to take it. You're involved in this. You don't know what you're involved in, but you got to do this. Um, but it also made her really unique because she had not a ton of formal training, math training, like at all. And then she also was just like, hey guys, I'm part of the project now.
So next we have Frances Bylis Spence, who was born in Philadelphia on March 2nd, 1922. Her father was a district engineer for the Philadelphia school system, and her mother was an elementary school teacher. She went to Temple University and then got a full ride scholarship to Chestnut Hill College, where she was pursuing a teaching career majoring in math and minoring in physics. She met Kay McNulty there, and they became best friends. She graduated in 1942, fully intending on becoming a math teacher, but when Kay told her about the ad that she saw in the newspaper, they both applied to the secret project and they were both accepted. She fell in love with a soldier who was working on the project, and after her time with ENIAC, they had a life together.
So then finally we have Ruth Licherman. We have like the least information on her. She was from Far Rockaway Beach, New York, and we know that she graduated from Hunter College with a bachelor's in mathematics, and then she worked at the Moore School and was part of ENIAC. And she stayed with ENIAC the longest, actually. Like a lot of the women left to like have families and get married and have children, and she stayed for a really, really long time. But she unfortunately died in 1986 before her story could be recorded. So a lot of these sources are like firsthand accounts from these women, and they were all interviewed at a specific time. But Ruth had died before this, and so we weren't able to get a lot of her story. And then in general, there just isn't a lot of information on these women because most of the credit goes to either the male programmers or the men who designed the concept of all of that.
Let's see. So, pretty much all of these women were originally employed by the Moore School to do ballistics calculations as, again, quote unquote, computers, and then they were recruited for an IAC. The purpose of an IAC was to calculate artillery, oh my gosh, I can't speak today, artillery firing tables, which are like booklets designed to basically kind of help aim weapons. More or less, it's, more technical, but anyway. So the calculations that were originally done by hand, they wanted a machine that could do that, and the programmers, these women were the programmers behind it. So also definitely wanted to mention that that there were hundreds of other women who were involved in the project, but these 6 we have talked about today were specifically chosen to work on this classified part of the project.
Yeah, so there were a lot of women who came before, and well, not really before, a lot of women who came after. So before we kind of mentioned like women were doing calculations, they had no idea what they were doing calculations for. There were a lot of those, like 200 of those. And then a couple people came on to ENIAC after these main 6 left, but these were the 6 original women who did the programming. So like people worked on the computer and ran it, but they didn't program it, if it makes sense. But while they were initially programming the ENIAC, the women worked in pairs. So Betty and Jean were considered like the workhorses. So I think Jean describes it herself. She was like, we tied up loose ends, we put finishing touches on everything. And then Marilyn and Ruth tested trajectory for ballistics. So I guess they were doing more of like the math stuff, and they were doing the exact calculations. So basically, like they did the calculations that the ENIAC was supposed to do, and then they had to make sure the ENIAC was doing the same calculations. And then Kay and Fran worked on slimming the machine down and figuring ways to reduce and reuse the program because obviously this thing is like 300 square feet. So they're like, okay, like what can we do to like make it smaller? What can we do to make like I don't think it was exactly code at the time. Like these are all like more like switchboards. But they were trying to make things like if they could slim down the programming, they could make the machine run faster. And there isn't like a ton of information like on the actual programming. It's just like they programmed. And I'm sure that there is information on like the technicalities of it. Do I know how to say it? No. And I'm not even gonna try. Um, but yeah. So they worked and they created the first real digital computer. But we do know that it was like 1,000 times faster than any machines in existence at the time. So yeah.
So, there's a demonstration that was held in 1946 where Betty and Jean were asked to show what the machine could do. So, it seems that they had, again, a trajectory program, but it wasn't in the ENIAC machine. In fact, they had never actually tested it.
Like the programming wasn't in the machine.
Right, so they could do it, but the computer couldn't do it yet.
Yeah.
So, the night before the demonstration, they put the program into the ENIAC and it was running almost perfectly, except it wouldn't stop when it was supposed to. Jean and Betty stayed up until 2 a.m. rechecking everything, and they couldn't find anything. Then, in the night, the solution came to Betty, and the next morning she flipped one singular switch, and the program worked perfectly. Jean said that Betty could do more logical reasoning while she was asleep than most people can do while they're awake.
That sounds right. But again, a lot of computing and engineering jargon would go into us trying to explain how the ENIAC works. I don't understand it. I don't want to pretend to understand it. Like I don't want to do a disservice to the women who like did such a good job and like put in so much hard work by like dumbing it down cuz I don't even understand the information enough to dumb it down. Um but from what I have kind of gathered is that they like wrote out the programming like on paper and then it would take them days to manipulate switches and cables and translate that program into the ENIAC. Like I don't know if you've I know your brother does like I don't know if you've seen like some of the stuff that he does, but he has to like write out like code on paper. I don't know if you've seen that.
Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, Geet does his like computery stuff and he like really hates one professor because obviously like nowadays you just code in a computer and so you just like memorize kind of like things that you do often or you can copy and paste things, but he had one specific professor that would make them write their code out by hand. They would have to memorize everything and write it by hand and he hated that class, which
That's
like I would
funny.
hate it too. And it's like if you like made one like forward slash and backward slash instead, like it was like minus 10 points.
Oof.
So yeah, that was not like, but that's what these women were doing. They were like programming it on their little like notepads, and they were like, okay, I have to flip this and I have to do this program. I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than that. But for context, so the machine could do 385 multiplication operations per second, and like not just like 2 times 2 is 4. Like it like did like advanced multiplication. That was like the most fancy thing they could do. It was like 3 square roots per second, and like 186 divisions per second, which is still a lot. That's per second. So
That's more than me.
yeah,
So, war is a terrible thing, but there's no denying that it promotes technological advancements. And IAC is just an example of that, but notably, its team of female programmers who would not have gotten the chance had it been peacetime. Unlike many of our female heroines, almost all of these women have made a major contribution to history and science, but then went on to get married, have children, and, leave science. Or, sorry, and have lives outside of the ENIAC, not realizing how important the work they had been doing was. Unfortunately, said work went unrecognized for too long. The six weren't even invited to the 50th anniversary of the ENIAC, but we can recognize their efforts today. There's actually a book called Proving Grounds by Kathy Kleinman that details the extensive interviews with 4 of the 6 original programmers to try and bring awareness to their untold story. So, the next time you go on your phone or open your computer, remember where it all started.
the end.